Number 1. Tiffany Morrison. Tiffany's friends and family thought she'd just stepped out to clear her head after an argument with her husband. 2 days later, police opened the door to her backyard shed and found something no one should ever see. On December 18th, in a quiet neighborhood where kids still rode bikes past chain-link fences, 34-year-old Tiffany Morrison disappeared. She was a mother of 3, a small business owner, and by all accounts, a woman trying to move forward after a crumbling marriage. She and her husband, 33-year-old Christopher Morrison, had been together since they were teenagers. They ran a massage therapy business out of their home, but by the end of 2023, the marriage was on life support. Financial trouble, mutual infidelity, and bitter arguments had turned their once close partnership into something tense and unpredictable. Tiffany had started seeing another man, Jake Hill, and friends said she worried about how Christopher might react if he found out. On that cold December evening, Tiffany vanished. No calls, no texts. Her friends and family reported her missing almost immediately. 2 days later, police came to the Morrison property with a search warrant. What they found was something no one could prepare for. In the backyard shed, the kind you might expect to hold garden tools or old bikes, officers found large trash bags wrapped inside a tarp. Inside those bags were Tiffany's remains. She had been shot in the face at close range, then dismembered. The investigation moved fast. Detectives noted a bullet hole in the couple's shower, and ballistic testing later matched it to the bullet recovered from Tiffany's body. Blood evidence inside the home told the same story. She'd been killed there, not somewhere else. But the most damning piece came from a man named Randy Slager. He was a friend of Christopher's, and he told police that Christopher had confessed to the killing. He said Christopher even showed him the body before threatening to kill Randy's family if he went to the police. Despite all of this, Christopher denied everything. He claimed Tiffany had stormed out after an argument and never came back. But his own mother, who had been close to Tiffany, told investigators she believed her son was guilty.
You called her at the back of the lawn. How dare you? And then you stand up here today and read of someone who was in love with this person. Is that how you treat people you love? I think the state nailed it. You're a narcissist. It's only about you.
Prosecutors built a case that painted the picture of a jealous, angry husband who snapped when his wife decided to leave for good. They charged him with murder and abuse of a corpse. As of today, Christopher Morrison remains behind bars. His trial date is set for later this year, and if convicted, he faces the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. Given the brutality of the crime and the evidence stacked against him, even the possibility of parole, if it ever comes, would be far from guaranteed. Number 2, Chris Watts.
It wasn't like an argument. We had an emotional conversation, but I'll leave it at that. But I just want them back. Somebody has her. Just please bring her back. I need to see everybody. I need to see everybody again. This house is not complete without anybody here.
When his wife and daughters disappeared, Chris Watts played the grieving husband. But when police checked his neighbor's security footage, the entire story began to collapse. On the morning of August 13, 2018, in Frederick, Colorado, 34-year-old Shanann Watts didn't show up for a business meeting. Her friend, worried after repeated unanswered calls, contacted police. Within hours, an officer was at the Watts family home, walking through rooms that looked almost too tidy. But there was no sign of Shanann or the couple's 2 young daughters, Bella and Celeste. What Chris told officers was she'd taken the girls to visit a friend. He seemed calm, even cooperative. He gave a local news interview the next day, pleading for his family's safe return. It was the kind of footage you'd expect from a desperate husband, except something about his delivery didn't sit right. What friends knew, but the public didn't yet, was that the Watts marriage was unraveling. Shanann had recently returned from a work trip to find Chris acting distant.
He was the one for me, and he is amazing. And I can't tell you how wonderful he is. One thing led to another, and 8 years later, we have 2 kids. We live in Colorado, and he's the best thing that has ever happened to me.
What she didn't know was that Chris was having an affair with a coworker and had been planning a new life, one without Shanann and the children. Investigators quickly picked up on inconsistencies in Chris's story. The neighbor's camera caught him backing his truck into the garage early that morning, something he never did. He claimed he'd gone to work, but the footage showed otherwise. 2 days later, Chris failed a polygraph test. Confronted with the results, he shifted his story, claiming he'd killed Shanann in a fit of rage after she allegedly harmed their daughters, which was another lie entirely. In the end, Chris confessed. He had strangled Shanann in their bedroom after an argument. With his daughters still alive, he placed all 3 bodies in his truck and drove to a remote oil site. There, he buried Shanann in a shallow grave, then smothered both Bella and Celeste before hiding their bodies in separate oil tanks. The brutality stunned the nation, not just for the crime itself, but because Chris had stood before cameras, playing the part of a grieving husband while knowing the truth all along. In November 2018, Chris Watts pleaded guilty to multiple counts of first-degree murder, unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and tampering with a deceased body. The plea deal spared him the death penalty. Today, Chris Watts is serving 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole at the Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. Prosecutors have made it clear he will never walk free. Number 3, Scott Peterson. He said he went fishing. But when the bodies of his wife and unborn child surfaced just miles from his boat launch, Scott Peterson's story began to sink. The day was Christmas Eve, 2002. 27-year-old Lacey Peterson was supposed to spend the day baking cookies, getting ready for a quiet holiday with her husband Scott. She was 8 months pregnant with their first child, a boy they planned to name Connor. By that evening, Lacey was gone. Scott told police he had last seen her that morning, leaving for a walk with their dog, while he went fishing alone at the Berkeley Marina. At first, it sounded like an ordinary missing person case, but almost immediately, things didn't add up. Neighbors remembered seeing the Petersons' dog wandering the street, leash still attached, hours before Scott claimed he got home. Friends said Lacey wouldn't have gone for a walk without telling someone, especially that late in her pregnancy. And Scott's choice to go fishing on Christmas Eve, with bad weather rolling in, raised eyebrows. As the search for Lacey went public, Scott appeared on television, pleading for her safe return. But much like the Chris Watts case years later, his demeanor struck people as oddly calm, almost detached. That impression deepened when, just weeks after Lacey's disappearance, a woman named Amber Frey came forward. She revealed she had been dating Scott, who told her he was single, and then later claimed he had lost his wife before Lacey had even gone missing. The case shifted from a search to a criminal investigation. Police tracked Scott's phone records, financial activity, and movements. His fishing trip location, the Berkeley Marina, became central to the case. Then, in April 2003, 4 months after Lacey vanished, the bodies of Lacey and her unborn son washed ashore just a few miles from that same marina. The discovery shattered any lingering doubts. Autopsy results suggested Lacey had died on or near the day she disappeared. Investigators believed Scott had killed her at their home, transported her body in his boat, and dumped her in the bay. When police moved in to arrest him, Scott was found in San Diego with dyed hair, his brother's ID, nearly $15,000 in cash, camping gear, and multiple cell phones. Authorities argued he was preparing to flee. At trial, prosecutors painted Scott as a man who wanted out of his marriage and impending fatherhood to pursue a new life and a new relationship, without the burden of responsibility. The evidence was circumstantial, but powerful. The affair, his shifting stories, his location on the day Lacey vanished, and the exact match between his fishing trip and where the bodies were found. In November 2004, Scott Peterson was convicted of first-degree murder for Lacey's death and second-degree murder for the death of their unborn son. He was sentenced to death in 2005. Today, Scott Peterson remains in prison, his death sentence overturned in 2020 due to jury selection errors. He now serves life without parole. For many, the case remains one of the most haunting examples of how a picture-perfect marriage can hide a deadly reality. Number 4, Neil Entwistle.
We may never know why this happened, but we do know that Rachel and Lillian Rose loved and trusted Neil Entwistle. Neil Entwistle will now live with his evil deeds for the rest of his natural life, only to be judged.
When police entered the quiet Hopkinton, Massachusetts home in January 2006, they found 27-year-old Rachel Entwistle lying in bed, shot once in the head. Beside her was her 9-month-old daughter, Lillian, also dead from a gunshot wound. The scene looked disturbingly peaceful. No signs of a struggle, no signs of forced entry. It was as if someone had walked in, ended 2 lives, and walked out without a trace. The idea that someone was Neil Entwistle, Rachel's husband and Lillian's father. Neil and Rachel had met while he was studying abroad in the United States. Friends described their early relationship as loving, almost storybook-like. They married in 2003 and moved to the U.S., settling into a modest home while Neil worked in IT, and Rachel stayed home with their daughter. But behind closed doors, cracks were forming. Financial troubles were mounting. Neil's business ventures in the UK had failed, and his income in the US wasn't enough to keep up with their expenses. Credit cards were maxed out. At one point, he was found browsing escort websites and looking into ways to make quick cash. On January 20th, 2006, according to prosecutors, Neil shot Rachel and Lillian in their bed using a .22 caliber handgun he had borrowed from his father-in-law without permission. The reason? Investigators believed it was a twisted combination of financial despair, shame, and a desire to start over without the burden of a wife and child. What happened next only deepened the horror. Neil didn't call 911, he didn't alert a neighbor. Instead, he got in his car, drove to Boston's Logan Airport, and boarded a plane to London. Within hours of the murders, he was back in England at his parents' home, telling them nothing about what had happened. While in Massachusetts, Rachel's mother grew worried when she couldn't reach her daughter. She contacted police, who performed a welfare check. That's when they found the bodies and realized Neil had vanished. An international manhunt began. Detectives from the U.S. flew to England to interview Neil. At first, he claimed he had discovered Rachel and Lillian dead when he got home from running errands and that he panicked. But inconsistencies in his story, combined with forensic evidence, told a different tale. The murder weapon, his father-in-law's gun, was later found in the Entwistle home. Gunshot residue was on Neil's hands, and internet searches on his laptop revealed chilling queries in the days before the murders, including how to commit suicide and how to obtain a silencer. In March 2006, Neil Entwistle was extradited to the United States to stand trial. The prosecution argued that he had methodically planned the murders, driven by debt, infidelity, and a desire to escape his responsibilities. The defense claimed the murders were a double suicide that Neil had stumbled upon, but the evidence didn't support it. In June 2008, Neil Entwistle was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, illegal possession of a firearm, and illegal possession of ammunition. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Today, Neil Entwistle is serving his sentence at the Massachusetts Correctional Institution in Bridgewater. There's no chance of release, and no explanation he's ever given that can answer the question everyone still asks. How does a husband and father become the killer of his own family? Number 5. Josh Powell. On December 7, 2009, in West Valley City, Utah, 28-year-old Susan Powell was reported missing. A devoted mother of 2 young boys, 4-year-old Charlie and 2-year-old Braden, and by all accounts, someone who lit up every room she walked into. Her disappearance started with a strange phone call. Susan didn't show up for work, and her daycare provider grew concerned when neither boy arrived that morning. Police were contacted, and soon officers were knocking at the Powell home. No one was inside. But later that day, Josh Powell, Susan's husband, returned with the children. Josh's explanation? He'd taken the boys camping in the middle of the night in sub-freezing temperatures on a Monday. From the start, that story didn't make sense. Friends and family told police Susan would never willingly leave her children or vanish without a word. Then investigators found something deeply unsettling inside the home. Traces of Susan's blood on the floor and sofa, a note from her expressing fear for her life, and evidence of a recent cleanup. Josh stuck to his story. But as the investigation unfolded, the marriage's darker side began to emerge. Susan's friends described years of control and isolation, financial problems, and growing tension in the household. She had even told some friends, "If anything happens to me, it may not be an accident." In the months after Susan's disappearance, Josh became increasingly erratic. He moved with the boys to Washington State to live with his father, Steve Powell, a man later convicted of voyeurism for secretly recording women, including Susan. Detectives began to suspect the Powell family knew more than they were saying. Despite intense searches, no one was charged. With limited physical evidence and no body, prosecutors couldn't bring a murder case against Josh. But in 2011, a major shift happened. A Washington court removed the boys from Josh's custody after finding disturbing images on his computer and learning more about Steve Powell's criminal behavior. The boys were placed with Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox. On February 5, 2012, during a supervised visit, Josh invited his sons into his home. As the social worker stood outside, he slammed the door, locked it, and minutes later the house exploded in flames. All three, Josh, Charlie, and Braden, were killed instantly. The fire was ruled a murder-suicide. For many, it was the horrifying end they had feared from the start. Investigators later revealed overwhelming circumstantial evidence pointing to Josh as Susan's killer, including her life insurance policy, his behavior after she vanished, and his refusal to cooperate. But without Susan's body, the case remains officially unsolved. Today, Susan's remains have never been found. Her family continues to search for answers and works to raise awareness about domestic violence and coercive control. It's a case that still leaves a mark, not just because of the unanswered questions, but because of the two young boys who never got the chance to grow up. Number 6. Mack Hacking. On the morning of July 19, 2004, in Salt Lake City, Utah, 27-year-old Lori Hacking supposedly left home early for a jog, but never came back. By noon, her husband Mark was calling friends, family, and eventually the police, saying he feared something terrible had happened. The search for Lori began immediately. A woman whose friends described as upbeat, responsible, and excited about the future. She'd recently learned she was 5 weeks pregnant. She and Mark were planning to move to North Carolina so he could start medical school. On the surface, it looked like a happy marriage and a bright future. But within days, cracks in Mark's story started to show. First, police checked the route where Lori supposedly ran that morning. No witnesses, no sign of her, no security camera footage. Then they looked into Mark's claim that he was enrolled in medical school. That's when they discovered the truth. He wasn't a doctor, he wasn't going to med school, and he hadn't even graduated from college. For years, he'd been lying to Lori, his family, and just about everyone he knew. Investigators believe that on the night of July 18th, Lori found out the truth about Mark's web of lies and confronted him. At some point, that confrontation turned deadly. According to prosecutors, Mark shot Lori in the head while she slept in their bed. Instead of calling for help, he wrapped her body in garbage bags, placed it in a dumpster, and then tried to carry on as if nothing had happened. The next morning, he called Lori's work to report her missing and even helped organize search parties. Police suspicions deepened when Mark was seen at a mattress store the day after Lori's disappearance, buying a new bed. They later learned he had thrown their old mattress in a nearby trash bin. The investigation turned into a massive effort to search the Salt Lake County landfill, sifting through thousands of tons of garbage in the summer heat. After weeks of work, searchers found human remains, later confirmed to be Lori, along with personal items that matched what she'd been wearing when last seen. Faced with mounting evidence, Mark confessed to his brothers that he had killed Lori, saying she had learned about his lies and wanted to leave him. In April 2005, Mack Hacking pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 6 years to life in prison, with the possibility of parole, though prosecutors have made it clear they intend for him to serve the maximum time allowed. Today, Mark remains in prison in the Utah Department of Corrections at the Central Utah Correctional Facility in Gunnison. Lori's friends and family remember her not for the tragedy of her death, but for the joy she brought to everyone who knew her. Number 7. Chris Coleman. On the morning of May 5, 2009, police in Columbia, Illinois, responded to a welfare check at the Coleman family home. What they found inside was every investigator's nightmare. In separate bedrooms, 31-year-old Sherry Coleman and her 2 sons, 11-year-old Garrett and 9-year-old Gavin, were dead. All 3 had been strangled in their beds. There was no sign of forced entry, no ransacked rooms, no missing valuables. It didn't look like a burglary gone wrong. The husband and father, Chris Coleman, wasn't home. He was out going to the gym, he said, but police already had reason to be suspicious. And it went back months. Chris Coleman was the head of security for televangelist Joyce Meyer, a high-profile Christian minister with a global following. On paper, he was living the perfect life. A good career, a beautiful wife, 2 kids, and a steady income. But beneath that image, there was another story unfolding. Starting in late 2008, the Colemans began receiving disturbing anonymous emails. The messages contained explicit threats, warning that if Chris didn't quit working for Joyce Meyer, his family would be killed. Chris reported the threats to his employer and police, saying he had no idea who could be behind them. Detectives took the threats seriously at first, until they traced the emails back to the Colemans' own home computer.
Was your wife alive?
Oh, yeah.
That's right. What would you say if I told you that I don't think she was?
I don't know. I don't know what to tell you. I mean, I think she was. She was.
As investigators dug deeper, they learned that Chris had been having an affair with a woman named Tara Lintz, a childhood friend of Sherry's. In private messages, Chris promised Tara he would leave Sherry, marry her, and start a new life together. He also hinted at a timeline that aligned disturbingly close to the murders. On the day of the killings, Chris claimed he left home early for the gym and tried calling Sherry when she didn't answer texts. But his phone records and surveillance footage painted a different picture. His travel time to the gym was far longer than it should have been, and neighbors reported hearing dogs barking aggressively around the time prosecutors believed the murders occurred. The autopsies revealed that Sherry and both boys had been strangled with some form of ligature. Investigators believed Chris attacked them while they were asleep, one by one, before staging his morning routine to create an alibi. The motive? Chris wanted out of his marriage to be with his mistress, but didn't want the embarrassment, financial loss, or public scandal of a divorce, especially given his position in a religious organization. In May 2009, just weeks after the murders, Chris Coleman was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The trial drew national attention, both because of the brutality of the crime and the shocking fall of a man who had presented himself as a pillar of faith and family. In May 2011, Chris Coleman was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Today, Chris Coleman is serving his sentence in the Illinois Department of Corrections. Sherry's friends and family continue to speak about her kindness and the love she had for her children. For them, the hardest part isn't just how they died, but the knowledge that the person they trusted most was the one who took them away. Number 8, Herold Henthorn. On September 29, 2012, Herold and Toni Henthorn were celebrating their 12th wedding anniversary in Colorado's Rocky Mountain National Park. It was a crisp fall day, and the couple set out on a hike to Deer Mountain, a scenic trail with sweeping views of the Rockies. But by the end of the day, Toni was dead. Herold told rescuers they had stopped to take photos, and as Toni stepped closer to the edge, she slipped and fell more than 100 feet to her death. On the surface, it sounded like a tragic accident, the kind of thing that sadly happens in national parks. But from the beginning, something about Herold's story didn't add up. First, his account of where and how Toni fell kept changing. The location he initially described didn't match where rangers eventually found her body. His cell phone records showed he'd been in that specific area for hours, far longer than he claimed. And the 911 call itself raised eyebrows. Herold was vague about their exact location, making it harder for rescuers to reach them quickly. Then investigators learned about the life insurance policies. Herold had taken out multiple policies on Toni's life totaling over $4 million, many without her knowledge. And this wasn't his first tragedy. In 1995, Herold's first wife, Sandra Lynn Henthorn, had died in a freak accident, crushed beneath their car while they changed a tire on a remote road. At the time, her death was ruled accidental. But after Toni's fall, police took another look. They discovered Herold had been the only witness, and there were inconsistencies in that story too. Friends described Herold as controlling and secretive. Toni's family said she had grown more withdrawn in the months before her death, though she never outright said she feared for her life. The FBI got involved, reconstructing the hike step by step. They determined that Herold had led Toni to a dangerous, isolated spot far from the main trail. a place where a fall would almost certainly be fatal. Prosecutors argued that the scene was no accident, but a carefully planned murder for financial gain. In September 2015, Herold Henthorn was found guilty of first-degree murder in Tony's death. He was sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. As of now, Herold is serving his sentence at a federal facility, maintaining his innocence despite overwhelming evidence. And for Tony's family, justice came in court, but the loss remains. And for many who followed the case, the most chilling part is that it took a second wife's death for the truth about Herold's pattern to come out. Number 9. Michael Peterson. On the night of December 9, 2001, in Durham, North Carolina, novelist Michael Peterson called 911 in a frantic voice. His wife, Kathleen, he said, had fallen down the stairs. She wasn't breathing. She was still warm. But when paramedics arrived, they found 48-year-old Kathleen lying at the foot of a narrow wooden staircase in the couple's sprawling home. Blood covered the steps, smeared on the walls, and pooled around her head. Michael claimed she had been drinking wine by the pool, gone inside ahead of him, and somehow slipped and tumbled to her death. But the scene didn't match the story. The blood spatter stretched far beyond what investigators expected from a simple fall. Kathleen had multiple deep lacerations to her scalp, bruising on her face, and injuries to her neck. The sheer amount of blood suggested a prolonged struggle, not a quick, accidental fall. Detectives began looking into the couple's life, and cracks started to appear. Financial records showed they were under serious strain, with Kathleen's high-paying telecom job in jeopardy. Michael stood to gain from her life insurance policy. And then came a revelation that grabbed headlines. Emails and online activity showing Michael had been in contact with male escorts. Prosecutors argued Kathleen discovered this on the night of her death, leading to a confrontation that turned violent. But the most chilling turn came from halfway across the world. Years earlier, in 1985, Michael had been living in Germany with his then-wife Patricia and their family friends, Elizabeth and George Ratliff. One morning, Elizabeth was found dead at the bottom of her staircase, in a scene eerily similar to Kathleen's. Her death at the time had been ruled a brain hemorrhage. After Kathleen's death, Elizabeth's body was exhumed and a new autopsy ruled her death a homicide. At trial in 2003, the prosecution leaned heavily on this pattern, suggesting that two women in Michael's life meeting the same fate couldn't be coincidence. They also brought in expert witnesses on blood spatter who said the evidence pointed to blunt force trauma, not an accidental fall. Michael maintained his innocence, but the jury wasn't convinced. He was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Then in 2011, one of the prosecution's key expert witnesses, Dwayne Deaver, was found to have given misleading testimony in multiple cases. This opened the door for a retrial. Rather than face the uncertainty of another full trial, Michael entered an Alford plea in 2017, not admitting guilt, but acknowledging that prosecutors had enough evidence to convict him. He was released, having already served 8 years. As of now, Michael Peterson is a free man, living quietly in North Carolina. He still insists Kathleen's death was an accident, but for Kathleen's family, the wounds remain, and the suspicion will likely never fade. Number 10. Scott Purk. On March 18, 2009, in the quiet Akron suburb of Stowe, Ohio, firefighters responded to a blaze that tore through a neighbor's home in the middle of the night. Everyone got out safely, but investigators quickly determined it was arson. Their prime suspect? Not the homeowners, but the guy across the street, 48-year-old Scott Purk. Why Purk? Because when police started asking questions, he just couldn't stop talking. He volunteered a story no one had asked for, about how, back in 1985, his pregnant wife Margaret had taken her own life by hanging herself in their apartment. At the time, it had been ruled a suicide. Purk said he'd been haunted by it ever since. To the detectives, it was an odd thing to bring up during a fire investigation, and the more they listened, the more the details didn't sound right. They pulled the old case file. In 1985, Purk told police he'd come home from work to find Margaret hanging from a rope tied to a basement rafter. She was 8 months pregnant. But there had been no suicide note, and some physical evidence didn't match a hanging. Still, it was written off as a tragedy and closed. Now, more than 2 decades later, Purk's sudden interest in revisiting the story made investigators wonder. Had they missed something? A full reinvestigation began. Detectives interviewed old friends, family members, even the original responding officers. The portrait of Purk that emerged was troubling, controlling, jealous, and prone to violent outbursts. Friends recalled that Margaret had been unhappy and scared in the marriage, and the medical examiner, after reviewing the original autopsy photos, concluded that her injuries were more consistent with strangulation than with suicide by hanging. Meanwhile, Purk wasn't exactly lying low. In addition to the 2009 arson, he was suspected of setting fire to another property the same night. The fires appeared to be a distraction from an upcoming court date on unrelated burglary charges. In 2011, police arrested Purk for the arsons. While in custody, they confronted him with the new findings in Margaret's death. Faced with mounting evidence, Purk eventually confessed, saying he had strangled her during an argument and staged the hanging to make it look like suicide. In 2015, Scott Purk was convicted of aggravated murder and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 15 years. He also received additional time for the arsons. As of today, Scott Purk remains behind bars at the Pickaway Correctional Institution in Ohio, serving a life sentence plus additional time for arson and burglary. He will be eligible for his first parole hearing on March 18, 2050.